Hey internets, so there are a lot of videos out there about gun rights, and a lot of books out there about gun rights, but most of them do not really delve that deep into the philosophy behind why gun rights are so critically important, and they often only refute the easiest arguments to refute, and that's what this video seeks to remedy. Because one of the most important things about human rights that everyone needs to understand is that the right to self-defense is necessary for all other rights to function. And if you think about it, you'll realize that this is actually pretty darn obvious. If you do not have the right to defend your rights, then you don't really have any of those rights at all. So if the state says you can't defend yourself against an attacker who wishes to do you bodily harm, then this is logically equivalent to a scenario where criminals have a greater than, or at least equal to, right to your body as you do, which means you don't really own yourself in a society that does that. Likewise, if the state says you can't defend your goods against theft, you don't really have a right to own those goods any more than the thief, and if you aren't allowed to defend your home against an intruder, then the intruder owns your house, you don't. This is why any outside force that would seek to prevent you from the right to self-defense is an inherently evil agent of aggression. Unless you believe that rape, murder, and theft and whatnot are good things, you are logically forced to accept the fact that people have the right to self-defense. This is why the right to bear arms is so important. There is no magical barrier that prevents people from violating others' rights. We don't live in that kind of world. We live in a world where, unfortunately, if you want rights, you need a way to defend them. This means being able to meet the force that is trying to take away your rights with an equal force in self-defense. At the very least, preferably with an even greater force, which means that you need access to the same technology for executing self-defense as any would-be criminal has access to. And therefore, gun rights is just the logical conclusion of realizing that you need to be able to defend all other rights. Anybody who agrees with the other rights but doesn't agree with gun rights is therefore just philosophically illiterate, meaning that they just do not understand the logical conclusions of their own beliefs. But in regards to being able to meet a force with force, this is where a big problem with how a lot of people discuss gun rights comes in, because a lot of people do not really understand what the state actually is. The state is an organization just like any other, with the only real difference being that the state is allowed to use aggression to enforce its policy. For example, say McDonald's. Now, McDonald's obviously isn't allowed to send their workforce out and force people to buy Big Macs at gunpoint. However, the state absolutely is allowed to do that. They can send their workforce, put you in jail for, say, not paying taxes for what it provides at gunpoint, even if you don't really want one of the things that they don't provide. In other words, the only thing the state really is just an organization that we consider to be legally allowed to use force for its transactions. Whether or not you want to argue if that is a necessary evil or not isn't really the point here, and is subject for a different video entirely. The point here is that for the state to function, it needs to be able to use force, and thus it must have access to the best technology available as well. And this just adds another layer of stupidity on the people who are saying that you shouldn't have gun rights, because it means that claiming that people should not have the right to guns, or should have less rights to guns, or however you want to spin it, is logically equivalent to claiming that only the government should have those guns. So for example, when a person says people should not be allowed to conceal carry guns in the library, this is effectively the same thing as saying only the government should be allowed to conceal guns in the library. Same goes for saying people should not be allowed guns in the mall, or the park, or in their own home, or on the freaking moon in the year 2089. Whatever. This also goes for things related to guns, so saying ban bump stocks is the same thing as saying only the government should have bump stocks, or ban a certain type of ammunition or whatever means that only the government should have that type of ammunition, etc., etc., etc. Any argument against gun rights in any situation or context is always the same thing as saying that only the government should be allowed to have access to guns in said situation. There is no way of getting around this. It's very important to start any kind of discussion about gun rights off with this very important point. Anybody who starts out against gun rights must be shaken down to reality and forced to admit that what they are saying is the same thing as saying that only the government should be allowed to own guns, and that only the government is allowed to decide if your rights exist at any given moment. The gun grabber position is an inherently authoritarian position, and anyone taking this position must be made to acknowledge this simple fact. If someone tries to avoid acknowledging it, they are either mentally incapable of understanding philosophy and therefore should not be taken seriously, or they are lying to you and definitely should not be taken seriously. This also brings us to our first major logical contradiction with anyone saying that we should ban guns, because any argument against gun rights is therefore effectively saying that because guns are bad for some reason, someone with a gun, aka the government, should be able to use their gun to threaten you to give up your gun. If you believe in gun control, you believe that that people who have been ordained to have guns and are just better than others for some reason should use their guns to enforce others having less access to guns. And how do we know that those who have been ordained to use the guns will not abuse that authority to use guns? Well, I mean, they're the government. The government would never do anything like that, right? This is sometimes referred to as the who watches the watcher problem. When you give one group sole authority on the use of guns, you're really just kind of hoping that they always do the right thing with them. You're just kind of hoping that they will never use that authority to steal people's other rights. Needless to say, this is not sustainable. Pointing out the fact that being against gun rights means being only for the government owning guns is also helpful in that it automatically refutes some of the stupider arguments out there against gun rights. For example, it automatically refutes the claim that guns don't protect your rights. Well, yes, they do, because even in the gun grabber best case scenario, when the government is doing the right thing in defending other people's property rights, it's just the government protecting someone's rights, using guns. If a cop is called to stop an armed robbery, what's the cop going to use to stop the robber? A freaking pool noodle? No, of course they will use a gun. They have to have guns. So it's not an argument about guns existing. Guns will always exist in modern society as long as modern society persists. So rather, it is about who is allowed to use them. And it's very important to talk about gun rights from this standpoint of philosophy, because the thing is, for any bad idea or invalid or stupid belief out there that people have chosen to believe anyways, there is an infinite number of poorly thought out arguments that can be generated in support of the bad idea. And when you understand the philosophy behind gun rights, what you've done is you've established a basic stupidity barrier, because a large number of arguments against gun rights are not really able to make the leap beyond this barrier of realizing the argument is actually about who is allowed to have guns. So you can think of the two facts that you need force to defend rights and gun rights are about whether people or the government should own guns as a general common sense barrier. There are hundreds of other stupid graboid arguments out there, such as guns are scary and dangerous, or guns only purpose is killing people, that also fail to make it past this barrier without refuting themselves. Neither of those statements magically change the fact that you need to be able to defend yourself to defend your rights. So either of those statements can be just automatically dismissed as philosophically illiterate claptrap. Won't somebody please think of the children is another good example of an anti-gun rights argument that fails to make it past this common sense barrier, because you need the guns to defend the children's rights as well. But a big one that doesn't make it past our philosophical common sense barrier is this recent one where you get these disingenuous midwits who have been deliberately misinterpreting the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution to try and say that either A, the Second Amendment was supposed to only apply to militias, or B, that the Second Amendment only applies to guns that were around at the time of its writing, which means that we should only be allowed to have 18th century Charleville muskets or something. Yeah, it's pretty silly. However, you may have noticed that I did not mention the Second Amendment up until this point in the video. And the reason for that is because you don't actually need the Second Amendment to justify the ethical and philosophical or logical justifications behind gun rights. The specific wording of the Second Amendment does not magically make the reasoning behind gun graboid logic any less idiotic. But because the Constitution is important at least to the United States of America and how it functions, let's just pretend for a moment that it does make it past our common sense barrier. Now, the main problem with trying to argue that the Second Amendment was only about militias or muskets is that I first off don't even think any educated person can actually believe this argument. That's why I call it disingenuous. It's very easy to prove that the Founding Fathers weren't talking about just muskets and weren't talking about just a well-regulated militia. Because if they were, then they would have enforced the law under that interpretation back when they were alive. But they didn't. You did not need to be a part of a quote-unquote well-regulated militia to be able to own guns back then. So obviously the founders intended for it to apply to individuals. If they did not, the historical facts behind the United States in the first 100 years would be very different. The founders were also plenty educated enough to understand that arms was a technology that was constantly changing and being upgraded. That's why they said bear arms, to keep it intentionally vague. If they just meant it to mean muskets, why didn't they specifically state in the Constitution that it was to not apply to any future gun technology, when the founders were very much aware of this situation? There were very noticeable advances in weapon technology between the 1300s and 1780. And if you want to get really specific and technical, it was James Madison who was the main brainchild of the Second Amendment, who graduated with high marks from Princeton University, or back then College of New Jersey. So he had to have known that this would be a thing. It is an extremely bad faith interpretation of the Second Amendment to look at the vague nature of bearing arms and conclude that it was somehow a mistake for it to be vague. It was not a mistake. James Madison almost certainly intended it to be. And again, let's just go back to reality land and acknowledge the fact that this argument, again, doesn't even make it past our common sense barrier. The people making this argument are trying to say that guns should be grabbed not for any kind of ethical or consequential or philosophical reason, but rather they are saying that guns should be grabbed because of a bad faith interpretation they are putting forth of a document written over 200 years ago. Absolutely nobody making this argument can be taken seriously. Because the whole thing is really just an example of the all too common authoritarian midwittery, where a pseudo-intellectual will point to a T not crossed or an I not dotted or some kind of nitpick in how a rule was written, while completely ignoring the philosophy and reasoning behind why that rule was written, or why the policy was put in place in the first place. Which again really just goes back to the who watches the watcher problem. Who's going to prevent the state from abusing their special gun privileges against the populace? Another bureaucrat above the state who has gun privileges even higher than the state? Okay, well then who's going to watch that watcher? You can have another bureaucrat behind him? Or how about that watcher? You can have another bureaucrat behind him? Or how about him? Gonna have another dude with even more guns above him? Yeah, and before you know it, it's turtles all the way down, except with government bureaucrats all apparently watching each other to make sure nobody abuses the gun privileges. Or you could just have it so that the entire population has gun rights. And the founding fathers understood this. And you don't have to take my word for it, just listen to some of the things that they've said from quotes from them in the past. And since we've been talking about James Madison, we can start with oppressors can tyrannize only when they achieve a standing army, an enslaved press, and a disarmed populace. Or how about this one from George Mason, to disarm the people is the most effectual way to enslave them. And then of course, before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every country in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops. From Noah Webster. So it's pretty safe to say that the conservative interpretation of the United States Constitution, at least when it comes to the Second Amendment, is the correct one. And there are many other quotes further proving this. When they were talking about militias, they were clearly talking about individual rights, and when they didn't specify which guns, it's pretty obvious that that was intentional. So then, that just brings us all the way back to our common sense barrier. Because now we have to ask ourselves, well, what about the arguments that do make it past this barrier? Well, here's the thing. If you're going entirely by natural law ethics, and which is basically just property rights ethics, technically nothing does. Because a person's right to self-defense is required for all of their other rights, to say that a person does not have the right to self-defense and therefore does not have the right to gun rights, you must also argue that they for some reason do not have any of their other rights. To take away people's gun rights, you must argue that people do not have a right to their own body, do not have a right to their own property. But at the same time, you must also argue that other people are allowed to take away that property, which means you are arguing, at least from a logical perspective, for an ethical model that doesn't actually make any sense. Because by saying that some people do not have the right to self-defense, you are effectively stating that some people have property rights to their own body and some people do not. There's no real consistency here. Now, you could say that, well, people do have the right to self-defense, but they don't have the right to guns. The problem is you're then arguing for ineffective self-defense, because criminals don't care about the law, and there are many, many ways to gain guns outside of the law. I mean, these days, you could really just defeat the whole entire gun graboid mindset by pointing to the fact that you can 3D print guns now. So does a person really have a right to self-defense if they have to defend against an attacker with a gun, while they are only allowed a knife? So it's entirely superficial. But of course, there are arguments against gun rights that are more or less consequentialist arguments, who will acknowledge that people have the right to self-defense, but because gun control makes people overall safer, then gun control is overall a good thing just from consequentialism. And there are various think tanks that have come up with arguments like these, usually just taking data out of context in order to try and prove something that isn't really true. Because here's the thing, gun rights are interesting in that they're not just good from an ethical perspective, but actually, consequentially, it is also good to have guns. To show you what I mean by this, the rest of this video will now be focused on said consequentialist arguments coming from these think tanks. The first of these comes from the Center for American Progress, which is a liberal left think tank founded roughly 20 years ago, and their article, Debunking the Guns Make Us Safer myth. The central argument they put forth is that most gun owners cite that it's personal protection as the major reason for why they buy guns. They then claim that these people's belief that guns will make them safer is false because gun deaths rose 46% in the states with the weakest gun laws. Well, how about that? Compared with 7% in the states with the strongest gun laws. Now, first off, this is a somewhat deceptive use of percentages here because the actual numbers aren't that high. Per their own own source, it only rose from 14.7 deaths per 100,000 people to a rate of 21.5. Second of all, the big weasel here is that they were only looking at specifically gun deaths, not deaths in general or homicides in general, but gun deaths. Well, duh, of course. A society with more guns is going to have more gun deaths, just like there were more sword deaths back in medieval times. This tells us absolutely nothing about safety. If you really wanted to prove that guns aren't making people safer, you would look at homicides and other property crimes in general. And of course they don't do that because that would debunk their study. Because their study, in their own source they are citing, doesn't really make it easily clear which states they are talking about. You have to jump to another part of their study to find that. And when you do, it becomes painfully obvious that they're lying to you. Looking at the bottom 5 states they give an F rating to for gun laws and comparing their chart to the homicide rate, Wyoming and Idaho appear to be safer from homicide than average, Kentucky is about average, and Arkansas and Missouri are worse than average. This paints a very different picture from the correlation they're trying to paint, suggesting other factors are at play. On the other end, California is about average, Illinois is worse than average, and the rest are somewhat safer. But again, this is not taking into account things like culture or socioeconomic status, reducing the relevance of what they're claiming here even further. It's also worth pointing out that the top 5 states with the lowest homicide rates are mostly D or F rated according to the same study. This is something that is a very common theme when you analyze it by homicides in general, instead of just focusing on gun deaths, ignoring the fact that again it's people who kill people with guns, not the guns themselves. There's no significant correlation with gun ownership or gun rights with any increase in homicide. In other words, this is just another example of the all too common midwittery of ignoring incentive structures and not working in how people think and act into their data, instead choosing to cherry pick data to find something which appears to support their conclusion, even if it makes zero rational sense. Another problem is that they claim that there's no evidence that guns are effective deterrents, citing an old study from Philip J. Cook on the effects of gun prevalence on burglary, deterrence versus inducement. And the problem with this study is it doesn't actually do anything in its methodology that would actually prove the point it's claiming to make. Because what you need to do here is you need to introduce guns into a community and then look at the effects of those community by comparing the statistics before and after the guns. Without doing that, you have no way of knowing if what you're looking at is a cause or an effect. Fortunately for us, there are other studies that look at what happens when you introduce guns into a community, or take the guns away, and then properly compare the before and after effects. One such study looked at the effects of Canada's increased gun legislation in the 90s and found no benefit in either suicide rates or homicide rates by looking at the before and after data. Instead, the rates of things like suicides just increased for other methods. Another simple study looked at the effects of Kennesaw, Georgia when they passed a law requiring heads of household to keep one firearm in their house at least. And the result was that they saw an 89% drop in residential burglary rate the very following year. In other words, they looked at a before and an after. Another obvious problem here is that when dealing with the issue of incentives, well, that's largely based on how people think. You do have to actually interview people and pull the data on that. You can't just say, oh, it's anecdotal, so we can ignore it. Because it's, again, largely about how people think. You can't just pretend like being unable to empirically examine the thoughts inside people's heads, then that means that the thoughts don't exist. That's just pure solipsistic insanity. And anyways, one study that did do such interviews found that felons were reporting that they did avoid entering houses where people were at home because those felons were afraid that they could get shot. And this was discovered in a study that interviewed 1,874 felons. It's pretty unlikely that they would all somehow conspire to lie about this. Another problem with claiming that guns don't deter crimes is that they're just kind of ignoring really obvious comparisons you can make. Like, for example, if you compare the United States to, say, Great Britain, which has way more gun rights restrictions than the United States, there are significantly more hot burglaries that are conducted, which means that they're burglaries committed when there's somebody in the home that is occupied by the person who owns it or is renting it. And the whole thing just doesn't even make rational sense. I mean, if you are a criminal, would you be more likely to invade a home or less likely to invade a home if you knew that there was a chance that you could get shot invading that home? It's just kind of an absurd claim to make on its face, and the only way they can make it is by lying with data by intentionally taking it out of context, which is exactly what these studies are doing when they're trying to say guns bad, because look at this little data point, please ignore the reason for why the data point exists. That's pretty much how they go about it. Anyways, the rest of the CAP 20 study is largely dependent on their false claim that guns don't provide a useful deterrent, and so everything else they have to say can just be ignored. And unfortunately, these kind of lies are very common. For instance, if you look at Everytown Research, they use a similarly flawed argument where they claim that the gun safety policies and gun control are saving lives by only looking at gun violence and not looking at violence or homicide rates in general, using pretty much the same flawed method and data that the Center for American Progress used. And that's another thing that people kind of need to understand when it comes to these arguments against gun rights. It's very common for these organizations to just sort of parrot each other. The Scientific American provides us with another example of this circular reporting, claiming that the science is clear clear, it's all settled, gun control saves lives. Citing, again, you guessed it, data that just looks at guns and firearm deaths rather than actual violence in general. Or how about Governor Gavin Newsom's page from California, citing new findings apparently that show California's gun control laws are working. New findings directly from the California Department of Justice. So let's click on that and see what that has to say. And to my complete and total lack of surprise, the study, once again, only looks at homicide rates and violence rates committed with guns, ignoring it from an overall perspective. For reasons I already went over, this proves absolutely nothing. And if anything, it just kind of shows you how prevalent this pattern is. It is extremely common for gun graboids to cite data that goes over gun violence rather than just violence in general. They are deliberately ignoring the obvious reality that guns are just a tool that are being used by people. Murder and violence are people problems. They are the human condition problem. They are cultural problems. And yes, the meme is true, it is often a mental health problem. But anyways, let's look at one last example of these think tanks. From the Violence Policy Center, we have guns rarely used to kill criminals or stop crimes, new VPC report shows. Now, right off the bat, their premise is kind of silly. You don't actually need to kill a criminal in order for the gun to be an effective form of self-defense, because the best self-defense weapon is obviously the weapon that you never have to use. Deterrence is what matters, and the evidence that guns are an effective deterrent is overwhelming, in addition to just kind of being pretty darn obvious. Again, if you're a robber, and pretend for a moment that you have no morals whatsoever, but you do care about your own life, and you have a choice between a victim that is armed and a victim who is not armed, who do you go after? That just kind of shows the ridiculousness of these arguments. The only way they can make their point is by deliberately ignoring common sense. It therefore makes absolutely no sense to argue that guns bad because there was only about 300 justified homicides, but almost 10,000 unjustified homicides using firearms. This kind of comparison only makes sense if you deliberately ignore what the entire point of self-defense is. Also, remember the fact that there's no real correlation between gun control and the homicide rates, when you account for homicide rates overall. When you take that into account, this study actually debunks itself, because it shows that guns are occasionally used in self-defense. And then of course, to everyone's great surprise, the study from VPC then goes on to make the argument where they only base their data on gun homicides, ignoring homicides overall. It is all just cherry-picking fallacy after cherry-picking fallacy after cherry-picking fallacy, and all of these think tanks just use the exact same cherry-picking. The point here is that neither the consequential facts nor the ethics are on the gun graboid side. And if we expand things even further, this just becomes even more painfully obvious. There are many countries that outright ban guns for civilian use, and yet still have high crime rates. This has been proven time and time again. More gun control does not mean less crime. And that's a really big problem, because gun control is a massive restriction on people's freedoms. Because again, going back to the ethics and philosophy, a restriction on people's gun rights is a restriction on their ability to defend themselves, which is a restriction on all of their other rights. And so the fact that it doesn't even work in consequentialist terms really just raises a red flag to how insane this is, because it proves that the only thing that gun control does is take away people's rights for basically no good reason whatsoever. And that perhaps is the biggest tragedy of gun control, because it doesn't actually do anything that it claims to do. The execution of gun control is just a massive waste of time and effort. Think of all the waste of police time that goes into confiscating guns from people who haven't actually done any real crime. Think of all the tax dollars wasted on bureaucrats regulating and managing the gun control. And that's really what gun control is. It's a massive waste of time and effort and money, all to do something that doesn't actually work. Which then just brings up the question, if it doesn't work, why do all of these politicians continue to circulate the same lies, which are then used to justify taking your rights away? I will not answer that question. I will instead just leave it to you to figure it out. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment for the algorithm. Or if you really liked it and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi or Subscribestar, or by buying some merch on my merch store. Again, that's all. Till next time.